I basically wanted to make just a couple of points about the international dimension, which people don't talk about much, of the farmer struggle. That what they're struggling for is not just minimum support price, but essentially the survival and continuation of our entire system of public procurement and distribution of food grains, which is under threat, because they are perfectly correct in thinking that the three laws which affect them very closely, but which have been rammed through without consulting them at all, and made into law. Uh, these laws basically are aimed at freeing the trade in agricultural products, of making it legal to carry on sale and purchase outside the government regulated mandis. And once that is done, it is not only the domestic agribusiness firms or the companies which are going into agribusiness now, which the farmers have identified, the Ambanis, the Adanis, and so on, who will come in. It will also be the foreign agribusiness firms. Now, we have to bear in mind a very important material fact that, uh, you know, that advanced countries which are located in the north, that is the United States, Canada, European Union, also Japan, of course, but Japan does not figure so much in the Indian context. These cold temperate countries, which are advanced industrial countries, are limited by the climate to producing a very small range of crops. They have raised the productivity of these crops, and these are mainly the food grains, wheat and maize in particular, and dairy products. So they raised the productivity of this limited range of products to such an extent that now they have very large, in fact, they have had for many decades, a very large surplus production over and above the demand of their own populations. And they have to find export markets for these products. Their own populations want to consume a range of tropical and subtropical goods, ranging from the beverages we're familiar with, tea, coffee, cocoa, and so on, which goes into making chocolate, to a whole range of vegetables and fruits. And nowadays, with air freighting, even 30 or 40 years ago, carrying produce by air from the developing world in the global south to the global north was extremely expensive, but now is very cheap. So their demand for perishable products has gone up enormously. It is not simply the products that used to go from our countries during the colonial period, but a whole range of new products which are perishable, which can now be reached to North America and Europe in a matter of 8 hours to 15 hours, which was not the case earlier. So actually the demands on our lands have gone up enormously. This is something which is not really appreciated. And what the advanced countries have been trying for many decades now, it's not new. And they've been, what they really want is that we should give up completely our system of public procurement and distribution of food grains. They're saying that, look, your comparative advantage lies in growing tropical and subtropical crops. Why do you want to grow and food grains at all? Buy your food grains requirements from us. We have plenty of surplus stock. And you specialize in producing the crops that you're best at producing. Of course, all this argument about comparative advantage is complete nonsense, because under the, it necessarily assumes that you can define cost of production. The theory is comparative cost advantage. Whereas in the developed industrial world, you cannot even define the cost of production of tropical products, because the output there of these products, because of climatic reasons, is zero and will always be zero. Global warming is not going fast enough for them to be able to produce, sugarcane in Nebraska or whatever, coffee in Canada. So they are highly import dependent for these products on us. And they basically want recreation of the colonial division of labor, which they had imposed by force, in which our lands were diverted more and more to producing the goods they themselves could not produce, but which their populations wanted to consume. But of course, those days they also, in fact, exported irrigated wheat and so on from India. It is not that we were importing grain from them. And this was because they were getting all these goods free as the commodity equivalent of taxes that they extracted, which is not a system which is there now. But they want a recreation of that old division of labor where we devote more and more of our land to the products that they require. But in history, we find always, whenever this has happened, not only in India, but in other countries as well, when more land has been diverted in the colonial period to export crops, then the absorption of food grains by the local population has gone down through a twofold mechanism. One is they were heavily taxed, so their incomes went down and their demand went down correspondingly. And the second is that measures were taken to actually change the cropping pattern away from the food grains which were locally consumed towards grain which was exported, which is irrigated grain, and to the tropical and subtropical crops, which the advanced countries could not produce. So there has always been a very severe decline of grain availability for our population. In fact, as you may know, in the colonial period, it reached extreme levels of periodic famines. It was not because we could not produce, but because because of this operation of this colonial mechanism that I've been talking about. Now, let me come very quickly to what has been happening in more recent years. And that is in the last, since the middle of the 1990s in particular, the US, Canada, and the EU have launched on a fresh drive to put incessant pressure on developing countries to wind up their food procurement and distribution system, which are, in our case, of course, our public distribution system is very heavily reliant on northern India, on Punjab, Haryana, Western Uttar Pradesh, because this is the granary of our country. So if we do not ensure the viability of our farmers in Punjab and Haryana, Western UP, then we simply cannot maintain the viability of our public distribution system. It will collapse. So this is why the farmers' struggle is of very great importance. It involves the food security of the entire nation. It is not just about how much MSP that they get. It is about a far broader problem, which Prabhat has been talking about to some extent already. Now, a lot of countries, in fact, dozens of developing countries. I was in Philippines in 1997 for a seminar, and 3 years earlier, they had been pressurized into giving up their own procurement and distribution system of rice. And that year, the rice output had failed very badly, and prices had shot up, and they had no stocks because they had given up their procurement and distribution system. Many, many other countries in Southeast Asia were pressurized into doing this. In Africa and sub-Saharan Africa as well, you had a big food crisis towards the end of the 1990s because they too had been forced into giving this up. Now, in our country too, there was a running down of the public distribution system, and for at least about 6 years before the food price spike of 2008, there was hardly any increase in procurement price. Because the whole idea was to run down our PDS, the whole idea was to actually go in for what the United States and the World Bank, etc., were telling us. So it was only the emergency of the enormous rise in food prices globally in 2008 that made the government pull back. And once again raised procurement prices, once again output started growing in Punjab. It had been virtually stagnant at 26 million tons of wheat, in Punjab for almost 6 years before 2008, because farmers were simply not finding it, they could not cover their cost of production since the procurement price had not been raised for so long. So India almost succumbed at that time, but we drew back in time. And after 2008, the policies which were followed have increased our output quite a bit. But now there is this new attack in the form of the 3 bills, which is really an entry point, again, for the entry of agribusiness corporations, again for the uh, absolute undermining of public procurement from our farmers. Because once you let these activities go on outside regulated mandis, then there is no check at all. Then you will have contract farming, you will have foreign firms coming in, contracting with farmers. And of course, these agribusiness farms are very big, they're very powerful. And whenever it suits them, they kind of don't follow the contract. If it is not profitable for them, they simply don't collect the produce from the farmer. If it is not profitable for them, they'll say that your quality is not good, and therefore we can't pay you the contracted price. We'll pay you something lower, which we have specified for poorer quality. They decide everything. And our farmers have made it very clear in the course of their agitation that they do not want contract farming. They do not want to deal with private business, not even the domestic. They have not mentioned the foreign businesses. But certainly the foreign businesses are an even greater danger than our domestic ones. You can probably deal with our domestic firms, but who will deal with Monsanto and Cargill and so on? You know? But the farmers have already experienced contract farming in Punjab. And they know that they cannot fight the big corporations if the corporations do not observe the contracted, the contract, as it were, conditions. It's a completely one-sided affair. I will end by telling you, giving you some data, or giving the listeners some data. This is something which is in a short piece which I published in a newspaper last week, that 2 years ago, as part of this attack on our food procurement and distribution system, the United States complained against India to the World Trade Organization in May of 2018. They said that, look, the WTO rules say that you cannot give price support to farmers. By price support, they precisely mean minimum support prices. You cannot give minimum support prices if in fact the value of the support you give is more than 10% of the total value of output of the crop concerned. This is the de minimis rule that they wrote into the agreement on agriculture. But look at the way that the calculation is made. They have put into the rules that the reference external price of a crop which you take for calculating support. What is support? Support is simply that you look at what the external or world price is, you look at what your domestic price of a crop is. The difference between the two, if you're giving a higher price than the world price, then that counts for positive support. Okay? So you must not give support which means a higher price than the world price. But how do you calculate? Because the world price is in dollars, your price is in rupees. So the rule they put in the small print is that you have to take the values for 1986 to 88. The average price of a crop at that time, converted at the exchange rate of that time. Now that is now how many years in the past? More than 30 years in the past. And the United States actually gave calculations saying that, you see, the average world price of wheat, for example, the exchange rate at that time, which was 12.5 rupees per dollar, it comes to, for wheat per quintal, it comes to 235 rupees only. Okay. The actual price per quintal, and they were talking about data, 3 years data. The last year was 2013-14. So it's not the current year or a very recent year, but 2013-14. But the complaint was made only 2 years ago. So they are saying that the wheat farmer should not get more than 235 rupees per quintal. Okay. Whereas the cost of production in the last 30 years has risen, actually it has risen tenfold. And the cost of production is now in excess of 2,000 rupees. But in 2013-14, the actual price that the procurement price the farmer was being paid was, for wheat, was 1,348. Let's say 1,350. So what the Americans did in their complaint is to take the difference between the two, which is more than 1,000 rupees per quintal. Because they said your price should not be more than 235 rupees. In 2013, So more than 1,000 rupees per quintal. Then you have to multiply it by the output which is eligible for support. And they took the entire output. And they came to the conclusion that 77% and 65% of the output value was being given as support to Indian farmers. So this is the kind of dishonesty that they engage in. In fact, the agreement on agriculture is something India should never have signed. Our economists at that time did not look at this absurd conditions which they had put in, and these were very deliberately put in order to shortchange developing countries, in order to push through their own agenda, because they give massive subsidies, but of course they give it in the form of cash transfers. They converted all their support, minimum support prices, etc., into cash transfers in the middle of the 1990s. And then they said that all this goes into the green box. It is not subject to reduction commitments. Now, who decided what is green box and what is not green box? They decided. And our economists at that time did not have a clue about the implications of all this, which is basically really to rip us off. So to conclude, I would say that I'm sorry I've taken much longer than I expected to, that the struggle our farmers are waging is an extremely important one. And it is not simply against the Adanis and Ambanis domestically, but it is really a struggle to maintain the autonomy of our entire national food procurement and distribution system, which, with all its drawbacks, with all its faults, it still provides some modicum of food security to millions of our poor, even though many who are actually eligible for below poverty line ration cards don't have them. But that is something we can rectify. But if the entire system itself is undermined, then you can imagine what a terrible state the country will be in. Okay, thank you very much.